And I can make you wanna stay. And I can make you wanna stay.
Actually, you know what?
Yeah, Robin, thank you so much for coming.
Hi.
The stage is yours, and we'll see each other at the Q&A session later.
Okay, fantastic.
Thanks.
Thanks. Hey, everybody. It's lovely to be here. I'm going to give you a quick sort of overview of my career and the goals that I've tried to achieve over the last 8 years with Funomena, and then we'll take some Q&A. So I'm a game designer and a developer, but I'm also a world traveler. I've been all over the world, had a lot of experience, won a lot of awards for games that I've made. And I feel really blessed to have had the career that I've had. So it's nice to look back and see that there's been so many fun and great, interesting experiences in my life, as well as games. When I started off, my very first GDC was the GDC where they announced the Xbox. And this is the photos I took from that session. It was a pretty amazing experience to just go from Chicago to San Jose, California, and see Bill Gates right up on stage talking about getting into video games. It was a very different time than the one that we live in now. Back then, there were about, I would say, 2,500 developers, and now, you know, GDC is over 28K. So one of the things that was true about that time when I first started going into games was that I was in graduate school. So I was looking at video games from the perspective of actually an artificial intelligence postgraduate degree. So looking at what would be happening, and the difference between then and now is that, you know, I've actually hosted GDC and been in front of thousands of people. So it's a really huge change in the size of the industry since we started. I started off working on the Sony Aibo, which is a robotic dog. I really love the idea of building things that were interesting to play with and tell stories about, and that was why I started in robotics and AI. My work led me to simulating robots in Half-Life and thinking about, oh, I'm gonna sneeze, excuse me, thinking about how games can be used as a training environment, and then that led me to thinking about how games can be made differently, and I started to become interested in experimental game design. I've never really liked picking one subject, so even in school as a young kid, I really loved to study science and art. And when I got to college, the feeling was the same, and so I started studying computer science, mostly just because I was bored with the math classes that I could take. Way back when, I actually decided to give more kids the opportunity to learn about games. As I moved into my environment of trying to study games in graduate school, there were really no programs. So I helped fund an education summit, which is still going, actually. You know, it's the last in-person one was in 2018, but it's now sponsored by Unreal. And so even at the time that I was beginning to think about making video games, it was really unusual to study them in school. So again, just more of an interesting trend. Independent art games were something that nobody really talked about when I started, and I ended up moving into that space, helping to found the very first game jam on the planet Earth. That's me in the lower left, puzzling over some kind of a programming problem next to my friend Sean. This is the very first time people got together to make video games as a group and then give them away on the internet for free. And that ended up becoming a format that, that sort of shaped the future of the world. EGW, which I helped found, is also related to the independent game development scene and started with showing the indie game jams, and now is in its like 20th year, I think. We're still showcasing the best independent video games from all around the world. I've also really focused on working on getting more women and people of color and queer folks into the gaming industry through events like Amplifying New Voices, which runs in concurrency with GDC, but also has been brought privately into certain companies to help them amplify the voices that they have inside that are different. And the framework that I worked on also helped lead to things like the Global Game Jam. So, you know, I had the privilege to be involved in the games community when it was really, really new. And now people make games all over the world in all different kinds of locations. The Game Jam, the Global Game Jam has over 75, I think maybe even over 100 now, locations around the world. The other thing that I've done in my career as I've continued to develop games is to focus on education and how improving the pipeline for education in games can also help improve the variability of the games that we make and the people that participate. So I am the founding director of the Games and Art program at Santa Cruz, UC Santa Cruz, which is the fastest growing major on campus. We have over 400 students now, and we're actually currently hiring for it. And this BA is actually going to be moving into a blended department of theater arts, of performance, play, and design. And so now what we're seeing is games are starting to influence theater, performance, television shows, the creation of alternate reality and virtual reality experiences. So it's really exciting time for games, even though it's so much different than when I started. I spent a lot of time as a commercial developer working at EA on the Sims and Boom Block series with Steven Spielberg. And then I went off and I worked on Journey, which was one of the most fun things I've ever done in my life, also one of the most challenging. And sort of walking around after seeing Journey be so successful, going around accepting awards for it and so on, what I realized was that when I looked out at the audience, a lot of the people that were looking back at me were the same. And I decided that I wanted to make a difference by creating a company that was more diverse and inclusive, just like the programs that I worked on in the past, and eventually also like the game program that I founded at UC Santa Cruz, because I believe that the rising tide floats all boats. So Funomena is now 29 people. We are people from all walks of life. Over 60% of us identify as coming from a unrepresented or underrepresented background. So cheers to all the Funomenats, having my morning mimosa here. It's really fantastic to have been in business for 8 years and to have such a fantastic crew to work with. We've been sort of showcased as a leading edge developer in collaborative development with emerging platforms. So we do a lot of VR and AR work, but we also do games for PlayStation. We just recently released Tom. Luna just came out on the Quest, is our premier VR title, which has won tons of awards as well. And we tend to work on games that are for everyone. So the company is for everyone and the games that we make are for everyone. The reason that I enjoy working on emerging platforms, though, is that I think that there's something very important about the future that we need to think about in the games industry, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. One of the things that games do is they alter the way that we perceive. And the way that we perceive is specifically different than one would expect when you start to think about augmenting your reality with glasses or with other information. The idea of reality actually becomes very different. So for example, if you have the ability to be a virtual character in a space where you spend a lot of time with friends, even potentially romantic partners, your reality is that in that world, maybe you're a giant bunny, or you are half giraffe, half dragon, or you're a cube that spins and when you talk, it changes color. Like, you could be anything you want. And so the idea of kind of what reality is changing. And I think it's really important to think about what that means for video games. The other thing I'm doing is eating my breakfast while I give you a talk. So, unique ability of the internet. See, already a reality of the talk has changed. I'm eating pancakes. One of the things I think it's important to do is assume adoption. It's really important to understand that the metaverse is coming. I originally wrote this talk in 2018, and it's still true today. I didn't have to change a single slide. Like, the metaverse is coming, it's gonna happen. People are gonna have access to more information, both with which they can project themselves and also with which they can engage with other communities online. And as we saw with COVID, it's expanding our ability to communicate. Like, I can be with you here and eat my breakfast and have some mimosa, and you still get the value of seeing me, and you didn't have to put me in an airplane and fly me all the way over there. So it's a really important time to really think about what does it mean if we adopt the concept of a shared mutual metaverse or extra data communication, especially around thinking about our natural environment. And so what's natural right now is that we have, for example, if I was standing in front of you on a stage, you know, that was physical, there would be a projection, there would be like a big screen behind me, maybe there would be lights, there would be all this electricity and content production work done to make me look important. And we've just eliminated all of that through this presentation. Like, I show up on your computer screen, you have it at home, it makes just a much lower impact. In the long run, if I go to some place physical and give a talk, I can actually work with the space very dynamically to project a lot of stuff outside if you're all wearing a projector set on your head. And so as we shrink down and reduce the scale of the projection technology and then personalize it to you, it really changes the concept of what a natural or built environment would be. And that's really interesting. I could walk outside and see a tree, and then I could see all kinds of things hung on the tree, say a memorial for the Asians that were killed in Atlanta recently. I could go downtown to the location where they were all shot and think about, what does it mean to have this kind of violence in my society? And I could leave a message there, and then other people could see it. We can change the way that we memorialize things, the way that we celebrate them, or the way that we think about things that are really tragic. I think the other thing that happens is it changes the way you think about designed objects. So, for example, what is a funeral if everybody there can share all this kind of information? What is a wedding if everyone can share this kind of information? What's a church service? What's a church? What are the sacred objects that we use in ceremonies? All of the ideas around what we do can be transformed by thinking about things as a design space that's much more expansive and data rich. But it also has some impacts on the way that we think about other people. So for example, I might be able to put on a pair of glasses even just a few years from now when I come home from school, because I'm allowed to have virtual time. My mom might be cooking dinner and I might say, okay, I'm gonna go and play with Pikachu in the backyard. What is Pikachu? Well, Pikachu's a character, but if Pikachu has a reasonable amount of machine learning and AI, it could become my friend. It could talk to me about what's happening at school. It could give me information about what's going to be happening with the weather or with the temperature, or it could be much more involved in the environment that we're spending time in because it can recognize it and it's been trained to know that one area of my backyard is a treehouse and another is a trampoline. It's very interesting to think about what virtual friends and virtual playthings will be like in the future. It will also help us get rid of things like physical distance. So I'll be able to spend time with my aunt who's in Arizona. I'm actually visiting her now. She just had knee surgery. She bought a brand new phone. And the phone has a really cool augmented reality camera on it. And maybe she can actually scan her space and then send me pictures of it. I can walk around in her garden, or we could spend time together on FaceTime. In the long run, maybe she could record a message for me and leave it for me so that when I get up in the morning, I just press it and she's there talking to me. The distance between me and my aunt is about 1.5 days car drive, but maybe it could be almost nothing. And also the time. She could record messages for me now, and then I could see them in the future after she passed away. These are the kinds of things that we can be thinking about now as a society that are very important and interesting to address as designers. So the reason that I bring these things up is that there's a lot of possibilities, and I've kind of done, the future sort of view of what those possibilities would be, but there are also some problems that we have right now that we have to consider. And I think that one of the things we need to do is move into a post-fidelity mindset. When you look at video games and the way that they've advanced, we can do just about everything with video games. This is a screenshot from Horizon Zero Dawn. They're already working on the sequel. It's going to be even more gorgeous. This is a beautiful rendered scene that looks really realistic. And when you walk around in the world, you can see lots of beautiful things that look really realistic. And then you can kill giant robots that look like animals that also look really realistic. They're futuristic, but they look real. But the thing about fidelity is that it has costs. You get away with the idea of realism by using natural spaces, and they have some sort of pleasing density, but they're not really real. So if you walk around inside of Horizon over time, you'll see the same plant repeated over and over again. The other thing that we're doing is we're trying to give appropriate responses, but not necessarily interesting ones. So in some games, the idea is that you have a lot of high fidelity characters, but when you go up to talk to them, say in The Witcher, they kind of say the same thing over and over again. And once you've gone through their talk tree, their dialogue tree, there's not much going on. We also simulate a lot of those pieces with physics and animation. So we spend a lot of time building advanced physics and animation systems. And then we script the stories and the emotional responses of those systems so that they give us the feeling of choice. But in the long run, actually, we end up spending so much time on the render and the physics and animation that we don't get to have as many choices. So for example, this might be a graph of a series of locations in a game like a Horizon. You can see that you can go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, or you can go 1 to 2 to 3B to 4B. And that we sort of map out these games with white space or places in them that you can go and you can shoot, and then you can go rest and you can go back. But what ends up happening in development, if any of you have made video games before, is that we run out of time because 1, 2, 3, and 4A are so expensive to make that we end up just creating the one path, and then we kind of keep that graph really small. The other way we do it is this, where everything is connected and you can just choose to move around. But again, we're kind of faking the dynamism of the environment, and often we're adding people, real live people, multiplayer to these environments to make them feel alive. So what I've been thinking about a lot lately is dynamism, the value of dynamic versus high fidelity systems. Dynamic systems feel alive because they're living and they're changing. They have a satisfying density, so they're not really real, but they have a pleasing amount of density that feels real for them. And they're interesting in their responses. So for example, a game like The Sims is not really real people in real houses, but it has enough choices in it that it's interesting to play for hours and hours and hours on end. Roller Coaster Tycoon, things like this. What we do in these systems is we simplify the space and the physics that is involved. So we don't focus as much on simulating physics or animating or high poly models. And instead we simulate those with really exaggerated movements. Like The Sims actually, when they started, they were both the same body type, both men and women. Now there's multiple body types and multiple ways of creating Sims. But at the time it was just basically one kind of human that interacted with other kinds of human in interesting ways and created emotional responses in the player. What this does is it expands choice. And the reason that people like to have more choice is that they like to express themselves through their choices. So a really good example of this would be the kinds of games that you play on a console that are developed over many years, say a title from Bethesda, versus the kind of games, excuse me, that you play on Roblox. Roblox games are developed in a matter of weeks or months, usually by kids. The kids really enjoy expressing themselves with each other and through their choices in the space. In these kind of games, instead of focusing on this sort of thing, dynamic spaces or games or platforms focus on stuff like this, providing lots of options and trees or ways to move around that are weighted and change over time. So The Sims is a perfect example of a weighted graph system. The sim moves around inside the world based on its need to fulfill its own goals. So for example, if it's hungry, it moves towards the refrigerator. And if it's sleepy, it moves towards the bed. There are weights associated with all those choices that change over time based on how much sleep or eating or entertainment or work progress the Sims has made. And games like Spore actually create systems that you can put together to create more dynamic realities further in the game. It happens to be that I'm talking a lot about Maxis games because Maxis games are one of the best examples of dynamic games, but Dwarf Fortress and many others are in the same category. What's interesting to me about these systems is that over time they become self-referential. And I put this slide in a while back from a Sims game that had all the characters that I developed for my Sims in it as figurines, which was really funny to me. But when you look at Roblox, you can see that the games that are developed there actually become memes and then they get put in other games. Characters move around in spaces. And so the idea of a system of games and a system of dynamic content that's generated by a community is really explosive and really dynamic and interesting in a way that just getting together to play Fortnite kind of isn't. What Fortnite does is it cheats. It uses people to create dynamic scenarios. And occasionally you can put a concert on and have a 60-foot tall dude and like cool Jordans like hanging out. But in the long run, I think that this kind of system is going to be seen very old, especially to the next generation of gamers that's coming along. One of the things that we also have to think about is the influence of this technology. So I want you to take a moment and look at the screen, and you can imagine it's in any city, any campus, any club, any bus stop. This is what people do already. They're already really distracted by their experiences virtually with other people. And what's happening is that we're getting into a place where we can move away from the one-to-one mapping of me looking at this, trying to reach out to several people, to where we can look at each other and we can either turn on or turn off our data. It'll be better for bumping into each other, but it'll probably be better for addressing some of the other problems that we have in the world. And so the last part of the presentation is really going to focus on these difficult problems. I believe that games can really make a difference in the systemic racism and the way that we treat people differently across all cultures on the planet. By giving us more data to express ourselves, we can subvert and change the way that we think about people in categories. I believe that the same thing is true for gender and sexist behavior and anti-queer behavior. I think that you can actually really reduce the prevalence of these biases by increasing the amount of information people have access to and giving them chances to identify in ways with each other immediately that don't use these old characteristics as ways of setting up hierarchies. I also think that games can really address topics of civic participation, especially games that are dynamic, that simulate systems like voting or water rights or food insecurity. There are really some interesting ways that we can get people excited about participating in real systems of governance by making better games. We can think very differently about money with games. So you can build different types of economies, money that behaves differently. For example, a stamp-backed currency, which is one of my favorite kinds, which is money that only maintains value as it moves around. So if you hoard it, it starts to lose value. It has negative interest. We can look at food insecurity and food systems and train people to think about how eating what they eat affects people on the other side of the planet. We can also start to think about homelessness and the unhoused and how migrant populations moving through spaces also impact all these other systems and are impacted by things like systemic racism, food insecurity, and so on. Most importantly, how they spread disease. The environment is a huge issue that we're facing. Obviously, we've done almost nothing in the last 20 years to really make an impact on our carbon emissions and to change the way that we're living. We have to do so much more. This last year has proved that if we stop traveling and we stop motorboating around in Venice, that things change for the positive, at least for the animals on the planet, and the environment does start to heal itself. Reforestation and a lot of these other efforts that are going to be in place, putting out lots more solar, wind power, thinking about ways to improve our ecosystems can be simulated in gaming environments, and game tools can be used to simulate them and share them with kids in classes as well as in college as well as in governments. So it's very important to think about how we use the technologies that we have now before they get so overloaded with commercial use that we forget that they're one of the most powerful tools for fixing this huge and important problem. The things that games do is they allow you to live alternative perspectives. And so that means that you can imagine alternative futures. I read a book a few years ago called The Four Futures, which focuses on the idea of four kinds of outcomes for humanity. One where there's abundance, one where there's scarcity, one where there's a very soft hierarchy where it's almost completely socialist, and one where there's very hard hierarchy, much more like a religious or military capitalist system, caste system. And it graphed out the ways in which if you go into these four quadrants where you're abundant soft or soft scarce, abundant hard or scarce hard, what those four futures look like. And this is what they look like. In the upper right is the ideal of a communist system or a socialist system where everyone shares and we have everything. It's kind of the Star Trek future. In the lower right is a more social system where we have to actually work together to figure out what we're going to do, and there's a lot of rules about what people do together. Then there's the idea that IP holders really run a lot of the content, and that you can essentially fab whatever you want, but you have to pay for it. And at the bottom, there's scarcity and there's a lot of military hierarchy, which means that there's a culture of exterminism where people actually decide that eliminating people is a good way to solve the problem of population control on a dying planet. Nobody wants to live in that future. What I think games do is allow us to establish new ways of thinking about these systems with connection, creativity, communication, and collaboration, which are going to be the ways in which we beat these things. The more possibilities that might happen are true than the ones that actually do. And what games allow you to do is look at what might happen and then think about what you want to happen. It allows you to avoid doing the confident kind of prediction that, say, a book like The Road does, which encourages passivity and depression and disengaging from the systems that we've built and sort of saying, well, the powers that be won't change them, so we should let go. The answer is we shouldn't. We should create a self-fulfilling prophecy, and what games can do is look at self-preventing prophecies. So the other way that we do it usually is we write books, or like The Road or The Uninhabitable Earth. We imagine all the future scenarios that are terrible, And this book is really difficult to read. It's very important to read. I think everyone should read it. And after I read it, I thought a lot about what could games do to help us actually think of alternatives to these futures that are outlined in this book, which are essentially 12 climate impacts that will have really important impacts on us as a society if we don't sort of curb them or stop them now. Possible realities are future realities, and games let you create future realities. And these technologies, which are emerging in the metaverse, like in systems like Roblox, where kids can create games together, or with headsets and handsets that allow you to see the world in a different way, that power is really important. And it's really important that you take on that power as a designer, as a creator, as a games person, as someone interested in media, even if you're in finance or if you're in marketing or sales or you're doing business development around these concepts. It's very important to actually ask yourself, what can you do to push us in the direction of thinking concretely about these problems and solving them, as opposed to stepping back and giving up and thinking that the world is going to look like Blade Runner 2. There are so many problems in this world, and there are so many victims, and most of them are young. They just showed up. They just came into this planet with all the systems and all the dynamic ways in which we influence each other. It's important for us to get out of the fantasy of recreating a very high fidelity fantasy of one view and thinking much more about how we can continue to do dynamic simulation, dynamic creativity, and dynamic collaboration to save the next generation on the planet. And when you wonder what's next, well, the answer is it's whatever you make. I've been in the games industry for 20 years. I showed you my journey. The best is yet to come, and you're the ones that are going to do it. So when I think about emerging platforms in the future, I think that they're for emerging people, and I think you're the designers of the future. So I'd like to encourage you to take the steps that you can to make a positive difference in the world. And that's my talk. Thanks. Now we'll wait for the people to appear. There they are. Magic.
Thank you so much, Rowan, for this amazing talk.
Welcome.
To all our audience, you can join our Q&A session via Gather Town. Just go in the audience room and join the Zoom link.
Yeah. Or you can just ask your questions in the live stream if you want to, in the comment section.
I'll just eat my pancakes while we talk.
And Robin, could you please stop your presentation?
I will do that. Stop sharing. Here we are.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
So we have the first question from our audience. Why do you think women are less represented in game development?
Women are less represented in technical fields where they're not welcome. And women aren't welcome in most technical fields because we have a bias towards thinking that women are less technical than men, which is absolutely absurd. If you look at other fields where women are dominant, it's in fields where we have the perception that women should be in those fields. And those fields are actually working to engage and include men. Teaching is one of them. So I think that it's very important to think about the fact that games is no different than any other system like physics or astrophysics or car development, space exploration. It's the same as any kind of really difficult problem solving situation. Just have to get past the bias in education and especially in middle school, which would be like kind of when you're 12 to 15, that causes women to drop out of technical fields and technical pursuits.
Great. And I see right now that Joseph Schinwald, our teacher and department head of computer animation and game is here.
Hi.
Thanks for joining, Joey.
Hi, Joe.
Thanks for having me. Hi, Robin.
Nice to meet you.
I would have a question since you're teaching at UC Santa Cruz. One of the major things I deal with as a professor for game design is how do you make your students look beyond their personal favorites, basically? There's a tendency to sort of recreate what they like to play, and I'd like to push them to go beyond, since I believe games can be more than just what you get in the top 10 list of your downloads. Yeah,
actually, I think that one of the most important things to do is to get it out of your system early. So in the program, we actually have a class that you take in your declaration year, which is your third year. You work together with people to make 3 prototypes in a very short period of time. And really encourage people to make things that look and feel like the games that they love. And then when they get to their senior year, they've had enough classes in activism in games, feminism in gaming, looking at queer games, thinking about the ways games are intersectional or anti-racist, by exposing them to a lot of smaller studio courses where they work on specific kinds of games, like an escape room or an autobiographical game made with found objects. By the time that they get to their senior year, they have a more open perspective about what they want to make. I don't really mind if people make games that just are like a Castlevania-like, or, you know, a really, really amazing tribute to, you know, Animal Crossing. It's fine to do that, but the reality is that those kinds of games are also incredibly huge and they take years to make. You really, in the system that we're in, you have 3/4 of 10 weeks each to make a fully functional demo. So you really have to kind of constrain the vision. And the best way to make sure that your game is cool without actually blowing the scope is to focus down on a very specific feeling that you want to communicate, or a very specific issue that you want to have some gameplay about, and just focus on the mechanics that make that issue or that feeling or that experience really concrete. And that helps you get away from thinking about it's like a jumping, you know, based, you know, like, I don't know, it's an endless runner, or it's like a Mario like you get away from those kinds of influences. And then the other way that we do it is we do a lot of visual critique, and we ask people to do comparison boards and mood boards, and we ask them to look well beyond games when they're looking at their comparison boards. So think about like film, sure, it's fine, but like think about fine art, think about sculpture, look at the way that we have abstract designs in projection mapping and like concerts, and like think about interactive technologies that go well beyond the space of gaming, and use that as a visual inspiration. We really encourage people to look at things other than video games in order to come up with inspiration, because otherwise they'll just be really boring.
Yeah, I think so as well. If I might add another question, since I'm just here, do you think that we'll see any effect of when we look at the corona crisis and how people's behavior changed, and video games being one of the areas that didn't suffer as much as other areas? Do you see a kind of change in how games, or in game design in general? We've seen Among Us rise during that time for good reason, I think. Do you think that there will be a lasting influence from the Corona crisis on how games will work, or what kind of games we will design in the future?
Yes, actually, I think that the most important impact is in the funding itself. So if you look at venture capital, it's moving into games at a rapid pace. There's a lot of consolidation, which means there'll be a lot of new companies that start after consolidation wave. There's almost always a proliferation wave in gaming. And so in 2008, we saw both a collapse of the global economy and a proliferation of startups. And what we're going to see is, as a result of COVID, we see a consolidation happening where studios are getting bought, and then we're going to see a bunch of new studios coming from that. And I think that the tools that those studios are using are going to include stuff like Roblox. So it's definitely going to be a very different future than the one that we have now.
Interesting. Cool.
Yeah.
Robin, thank you very much.
No worries.
It was Journey as well as Luna, very dear and near to my heart. Thank you for both of those projects, and thank you for being here. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, Robin, we got a question from the chat, and Felix asks if you can tell a bit more about your opinion on the responsibilities of games having on the society.
Yeah. I think the games actually are just another one of the many media forms that we've created. And I think that one of the best things about the current situation is that emerging technologies don't necessarily have to have the same terrible influences of racism and gender discrimination that film, television, and radio had, and games too. But I also kind of think that games is way more progressive than most every other medium. I think when you look at the way that we have changed even in the last 5 years as a result of Gamergate, and the way that we're including more people and talking more openly about what community means and how we want our games to reach people, and how we want people to be able to play together without feeling harassed or unsafe. I think we've actually made a lot more progress in games than a lot of other people have. So the community of developers is really, really flexible and kind. I think whether or not the fan community catches up is really going to be up to them. And I think it's already, if you look at Gen Z gamers and alpha gamers, like, again, in systems like Roblox or Minecraft, and some of the other systems that are just coming up, like, you're going to see the community principles and the way that we treat each other is really going to change. And so I think games are responsible for influencing people, but I think they're also part of a system that has been just filled with bias for a really long time. And as we age up and out of our roles as senior people in the industry, more younger people come in, we'll make better content that's more inclusive.
Okay,
Cool.
we've got another question from the chat. What's the difference between a sexual character and a sexualized character in a game in regards of the male gaze?
Well, so I think that, this is, I've been an advocate for sexy games for a long time. And I actually gave a talk at was probably the Independent Game Developers Showcase at GDC. There's a 2-day workshop that we do. I gave a talk about like, if I could do anything, what would I do? And I was like, if I could get any kind of new game experience, I would really like games that were about intimacy and love and sex and connection, sensuality, eroticism. Like, it's really sad, actually, that video games exist and that there aren't games that talk about falling in love and the nuances of being in a relationship, wanting to be with someone, but also having eyes for someone else. The idea that you may like people from a spectrum of genders or, performance of gender or sexuality. Like, there's so many opportunities to make games like that, and they haven't been made. And platforms, will often not keep them if they are made. So when you look at the kinds of games that are made by innovators in this space, a lot of times their games get taken down off of Apple or Android because, ooh, it's sexy. The difference between a game for adults and adult gaming, right, is that like a game for adults includes sex and intimacy as part of itself. Adult gaming is essentially pornographic. It's a release. I don't have a problem with either of those things existing, but it's kind of sad that one exists and the other is completely invisible in this space. It's actually really bizarre to me. I wish that we could see like a really awesome set of female founders, like queer founders, like make a super sexy game that just blows up and does really well, like a great sex MMO or something. I don't know. It would be really nice, but so far all those attempts have really fallen flat, and actually they've been pretty bad. So I've checked them out and they're not that great. Second Life is probably the one that's the most experienced and stable, and it's just still Second Life. So I don't know. That's a good question. I wish I knew, but we haven't seen an example of something that's truly, genuinely sexy. So I don't think I can comment on it.
Okay, I would have a question myself, and it's in school I learned a lot about the MDA framework.
Yeah.
And then I realized the paper is you wrote the paper, and I wanted to ask how did you discover it, and if you could tell a little bit more about that.
So the MDA framework was actually developed by Mark LeBlanc, and he came up with it with a couple of other developers, Doug Church, Chris Hecker, John Blow, basically the crew, all of us that was doing the first indie game jam. We were sort of game nerds, and a lot of us were from MIT. There was a game company there called Looking Glass. They made System Shock and Thief. And a lot of the kids that were making games there were really interested in dynamic systems and simulation, including Doug and Mark. And Mark decided that he would work with the rest of that crew to kind of come up with a way to talk about games that got away from the word fun and give a talk about it at GDC. And so there was kind of a bunch of us kind of collaborating to talk about like, what does that really mean over a period of maybe 5 years? And Mark gave a couple of talks, and then we decided to do a workshop called the Game Design Workshop at GDC, which was a 2-day event designed specifically to teach people to stop thinking about, is this fun or isn't this fun? And to start applying verbs to the kind of gameplay they were using to make the games they were going to make. And the reason that you do that is if you figure out the verbs ahead of time, then you don't wander off in space looking forever to try and figure out a good verb. You do most of the work on the verbs ahead of time, and in that way you can tailor the game as you tune it and build it. And it's much better. It's just better to build that way. It's better to build from the mechanics first than to build from the aesthetics first than from the mechanics first. Because if you just say, okay, it's going to be a platformer and it's going to have a bunny, why is that fun? Whereas if you say it's going to be about this character that's going on this journey that needs to achieve this thing, and these are the obstacles it's going to encounter, and then you come up with mechanics from those obstacles, it's going to feel continuous and whole. So
cool.
Yeah, the next question is, in what ways do you think systemic racism excludes people from pursuing a career in game development?
It starts really early with the schooling. It's very difficult, even just like if you look at in the United States, for example, there's a huge school to prison pipeline. Kids from different backgrounds with different ways of expressing themselves get punished for being loud or bossy, and then they get put into detention, and then they go into prison before they can even get to college. So it starts right there. In the United States, it's really bad systemic racism problems in general in education. But then once you get past education, it's in the job market itself. It's in the way that people evaluate resumes. Like if I say to you, imagine a dancer. What does that dancer look like in your head? Is it a white girl ballerina? Probably, like if I say, imagine a couple walking down the street, pushing a baby carriage. Is that couple able-bodied? Are they both white? Or are they both the same gender? Or, like when you start to really think about what the bias is in your head, it's present all the time. The way that it starts is that you have to think about what your bias is. You have to learn to experience your bias as you experience it consciously as opposed to unconsciously, and then work against it. It's a huge problem, and it's endemic to everything in the world. It's not just video games. But I would say the majority of the reason that people get locked out of participating, especially in technology careers, is either that they can't get into the educational systems that will help them because they're already coming from a post-traumatic or post-poverty situation, where they're already being pushed into criminal justice systems, or if they make it all the way through and they're exceptional, they're so unique that they can find a job anywhere. And why would you go into video games when there's no people of color, women and queer folks at the company that you're interviewing at? You could just as easily go to work at Microsoft on a brand new HoloLens technology, or go into finance, where you're going to make a lot of money for all the effort that you just put in. So we don't really have a really great value proposition for people of color in games unless we actually are willing to change the way that we hire, promote, and retain people of color. So it really starts with getting at the unconscious bias in your own head, and then building systems that take that out of hiring and retention processes. We've worked very hard on that at Funomena, actually.
Okay, and we got a question in the chat from Felix, and he asks,
This one.
sorry, we had the question from Felix before. The other question would be, do you think humanoid robots like Sophia will someday be part of our society like we are?
Yeah, I do. I actually think that there'll be a point where we have virtualized friends or people that we use kind of like a diary, that develop alongside us, like the Ladies Illustrated primer in Diamond Age. But I also think that there will be ways in which we virtualize ourselves. So for example, like I talked about with my auntie, like I can totally imagine if she could, that my aunt would speak to a virtualized version of my uncle who passed away a couple of years ago. She just replaced her phone, like I mentioned. And when she put her phone away after she had a Galaxy 4, I think, and she bought a Galaxy 21 Ultra. So it was like, 8 years of phone technology. But when she took her old phone and like, we transferred the information to the new phone, she said goodbye, Edward, to my uncle, because it was a phone that they had bought together, and also there was a little picture of him on it, and like she associated this object with him and like wherever he is now. So I think that it's very weird when people say, oh, no one will ever be able to have feelings about a virtual being or robots or whatever, when we have feelings about our phones. And like, I pick up rocks when I'm walking with my partner in the wilderness, and then I put them somewhere and I just think, oh, you're together near this rock, and he thinks it's really stupid, but I love it. So, we have all kinds of ways in which we mystify and create value in objects. It's a human trait to be both superstitious and religious and creative at the same time. There's no reason that we can't do it with a virtual character. That's anyone who says that is being absurd.
All right. The next question is, what were your favorite childhood games that you got into gaming and then later game development?
So I grew up when video games became. So, I was able to go to the pizza parlor and play Miss Pac-Man with a quarter while we were waiting for the pizza. And I always want to go because I want to play the Miss Pac-Man and or play like a tabletop racer game like Rally X. So my first experiences were arcade games when I was probably 8 or 9. And then I had seen computers because my dad worked as an engineer at a nuclear power plant, and there were big computers there. So I had seen computers and computer paper, but I didn't really understand the concept of games as like being on a little computer in your house until I had seen a friend's ColecoVision at her house and played a lot of Pitfall. So I think the first game I played a lot of was Pitfall, but it was really hard because the way that we would play is that she would play, and then when she died, I would get the controller and I would play. And then when I would die, she would get the controller, but it was at her house. So she would play all the time and I would get like 10 seconds when I would die. No. So I didn't really like it. I mean, I was fascinated by it, but it was not fun because I never had it at home, so I couldn't get good at it. The first game that I got really good at was a game called Mule, M-U-L-E. It's a simulated, it's a sim basically that came out on the Commodore 64 and the Atari. Made by the very first trans designer in our industry, Danny Booten. And it's essentially you are farming the planet, like a foreign planet like Mars, and you play against other people with your controllers in front of the screen, but you're also playing against the AI, and you're trying to get, trying to place bets on your land and essentially raise crops or, mine ore or whatever. And then you go into town and you sell it, and you're trying to bid against each other to get the best price. And I played it both solo and multiplayer a lot when I was like in 7th grade, so when I was like 12, 13. And I was obsessed with like, how did the computer know what I was going to do? And like, how could it fight me and my friend Katerina at the same time? Like, that was really weird to me. And I think it had a huge impact on the way that I think about games and why I've ended up building social games like Journey, is a perfect example of a game that comes from a desire to connect people through the screen in an interesting and new way. So yeah, I love Mule. It's one of my favorites. I've always wanted to make a version of it. Maybe I'll get EA to lend me the license and do a virtual Mule.
Yeah, Robin, thank you so much for coming and this great Q&A session.
No worries.
And we have a digital festival space in Gathertown. And it would be great if you join us in Gathertown, and we maybe could see each other there and talk a little bit more.
I would love to, but I actually have to go and see my auntie who's just recovering from knee surgery. So I'm actually going to visit her. She just had her staples out. And after this talk, I have to go drive out to her desert compound and make sure she's doing okay. So I won't be able to hang out, but I really, really enjoyed spending time with you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, Robin. Bye.
Bye. Take care. Be good.
You too.
Change the world. Bye.